Okay, welcome to the October meeting of the Columbus Astronomical Society. Got a few things to cover tonight. We got elections coming up in December, so we need volunteers for our nominating committee. Usually 3, so or if anybody's interested in running for an office, we've got an empty trustee slot because Raj had to, take off and business took him out of the country. We need a treasurer. The offices are going to be open, president, vice president, secretary, that sort of thing. So anybody who's interested in any of those offices, we'll be open. You can volunteer for the job, or we'll, take nominations. Yes, sir.
What about the website, the webmaster?
Oh, well, that's not an elected position, so,
Well, it's not an elected position, but
Yeah, we will need somebody to help with that too, because Raj was doing that.
Yeah.
So if anybody's interested in helping with the club website, just let me know. And okay, so we did have a donation. Mr. Fred Durant donated a Dobsonian tracker mount that allows us to use a Dobsonian telescope and track for a while anyway, which you normally can't do with the Dobsonian. You have to adjust your view with both azimuth and altitude. Yeah. Let's see. No more CAS meetings until November. Right. So I know you'll just have to keep working on what you've been doing.
keep on processing the
Yeah. And also a reminder, we do have a telescope loaner program. We've got several scopes that are available for loaning for people who don't have a scope and the club members. You could sign it out for a month at a time. So just, get in touch with me if you have need of that. And what do we got?
We have one visitor tonight, one guest.
Okay.
We have Ann Holcomb. She's just right here in front. Welcome, Ann. We're always glad to have guests. And then I do have a event that's kind of a short notice. I just got this last week. They would like for club members to help out with a Glacier Ridge Homestead Metro Park Ridge Fest. It's for a week from today, October 18th from 12 to 4. I've got a sign-up sheet. If you are interested in helping out with that, sign up. I realize this is late notice. The lady apologized for the late notice, but that's just the way it is. So if you can do it, fine. If you can't, understood. So I'll just pass this around. If you would sign it, if you can do it, put it around both sides if you would. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a successful outreach program today. We were down at Slate Ridge Metro Park, and they were having a community festival down there. And we were down there passing out a little bit of literature information and, talking to people about the club and telescopes. So it's kind of a fun thing, something to get out and maybe meet a few interested people. So, Brad, do you have anything?
Yeah. Just a short reminder that the John Glenn Astronomy Park is still doing programs. We do the programs on clear Fridays and Saturday nights. Our last night of the year until we take a winter break will be the weekend before Thanksgiving. And so you guys know, since you live in Ohio, that Ohio weather is uncannily cloudy on December and January and February nights. And so it's also very cold, and the icy plaza gets a little slippery at times, so it's probably not a good idea to have lots of programs. That said, we were thinking about inviting CAS members down sometime around the new moon in January to have a program just for the CAS. This is something we've done in the past. Back in 2000, I came up with a name for it. It was called the Wintertime Experimental Reschedulable Night Under the Stars. Spell out that acronym. We are nuts, okay, which basically is what you have to be in order to be outside in January in the middle of the night. If it happens to be clear one of those 2 weekends, it would be nice to go down there. The winter skies there are glorious, and I'm thinking of making that an actual feature of our calendar down there. We will do a January program for that, so that's pretty much all I have. So.
And Don, you have a couple of words.
Thank you. I am Director Perkins Observatory, Don Stevens, and we are continuing our programs on Friday nights through mid-December. Actually, the last Friday night program we'll do will be the Friday before the CS holiday party. So if it's a nice night and you want something to do on a Friday night, you can come show the folks stuff through telescopes. And again, you don't need to be an expert. You don't even have to have the telescope. We've got a couple extra telescopes in there you can use. So it's always helpful to have some folks out front helping out. And I'd like to shout out a couple of people who have been very consistent and helpful on the Friday nights, Mark Peter and President Charles Let's-Go here. They've been very, very helpful with the program. So do come help give them a hand out there if you can. I'm also, on the Friday night of Halloween, the 31st, we're not doing a public night that night. I've reserved that night for you folks. Think about hosting a movie night that night. So I've decided, based off some suggestions, it's going to be a Mel Brooks night. So we're going to do Young Frankenstein and Spaceballs, and, you know, maybe something, I don't know, maybe silent movie or something, I don't know. But that will be the theme for that night, and basically it'll start at 8 p.m. and go to whenever. So bring some popcorn, bring snacks, a blanket and lawn chair. If it's clear, we'll also do some observing. So it'll be a night for you guys, and we'll project the movies up here on the screen. So it should be a lot of fun.
Okay, so you ready, Alex?
We're ready.
Okay. So Alex is going to do our presentation for tonight. Right. And he's going to, after his presentation, going to demo we have 2 new sea stars, which are computerized telescopes for doing photography. And those are going to be in a loaner program too. But he's going to do a quick demo so people have an idea of how to use them.
Thank you very much. Just going to see if there's is this too dark?
We're good.
All right. So with that being said, good evening, everybody. My name is Alex McCarthy, currently the treasurer of the Columbus Astronomical Society. Obviously, that means I'm very passionate about astronomy, but I'm also a really big fan about this whole space race that we had nearly half a century ago. So tonight, what I'd like to do is talk to folks, talk to everybody in here a little bit about how did we go from pretty much no flight at all to getting our first set of astronauts into space. After the presentation tonight, as Charles said, the club recently did purchase 2 C-Star S50 telescopes. To be frank, they're pretty cool to work with. So after this is all said and done, we'll set those up out on the front lawn for those who want to get a close look on how to use those. I'll have one of them target Saturn, and we'll pick a deep sky object with the other one. So looks pretty clear out there tonight, and let's have some fun with that. So with the presentation tonight, what I'm going to do is really set the bureaucratic foundation for the space race. Despite this lovely image of the Atlas rocket careening off into space, we're actually not going to get to the point in time where we're sending Alan Shepard into space for the first time there. But what I really want to do is talk about how we ended up getting NASA. So we'll talk a little bit about the history behind all that. So it's kind of a breakdown. We're going to talk a lot about atmospheric flight of all things. We're going to talk about some of the early years of flight in America. We're going to talk about a concept called the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics and how it played a role in early flight research within the United States, as well as early development of aircraft technology in the United States. And then we'll talk a little bit about Sputnik and how the political situation around that led to the formation of NASA. So, 1903 was a pretty big year for manned flight of all things. On December 3rd of that year, around Washington, D.C., there was a guy, Samuel Langley at the time, associated with the Smithsonian Institute, who tried and failed to test a powered aircraft in flight. It ended up crashing into the Potomac. Unbeknownst to Langley, about the same time, Wilbur and Orville Wright from Dayton, Ohio, were also finishing up their design for their aircraft and getting that over to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Ohio's nice and all that, but as we've kind of harped upon earlier, weather around December around here is just not all that good. So they went to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in the Outer Banks, where weather tends to be a lot more predictable. You get really good winds that time of year, and it was just an opportune place to try to fly a plane. So about 2 weeks after that, I believe it was December 17th, they had their first successful manned flight. The important thing here is, up to this point, people have used gliders to get an aircraft from a high place to a lower place, but here they were actually able to start and end at the same elevation using powered flight. So that was what really set that aside. So they had this aircraft, and they spent the next couple years in Dayton, near what's present-day Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, perfecting their aircraft. And it turns out that they were also trying to sell this to an extent. It took the United States government a couple years to develop some interest in purchasing their plane, but in 1908, the U.S. government purchased the first Wright Flyer, but really there was not that much of an early interest in aircraft at the time. Here in the United States, aircraft research was just progressing really slowly. In Europe, however, there was a much more tense political situation among the nations. There was a lot of weapons and arms buildup at the time, and a lot of those governments knew that war was probably on the horizon, and it was probably going to be a pretty immense war. So while things in Europe really started to progress militarily, there was a lot of research and development going on both with aviation and non-aviation related military needs. Here in the United States, a lot of the development that we were doing, albeit limited, was focused more on private ventures, kind of being led by private initiatives and daredevils, kind of looking at different ways to fly. It was a lot less coordinated than in Europe. To work. Sorry, I've got a new computer and a very sensitive mouse, so let's try this one. Around 1911, we're getting on the precipice of World War I here, and you start to get some of the academics in the area to want to see some of our aerodynamic research to speed up a little bit here in the United States. And you had various Americans that were lobbying the Taft administration to establish some sort of national aeronautic laboratory, some way to start to coordinate research efforts in order to improve how we understood flying and how effective our planes actually were. In 1911, the initial kind of idea that was in mind was to have the Smithsonian Institution take leadership on this. Viewed as a nonpartisan kind of platform, it was seen as kind of the crowning jewel there of kind of U.S.-led research initiatives, but ultimately that failed. The Washington Star newspaper in D.C. at the time reported that the administration was planning to do this laboratory under the Smithsonian. Whether the administration was really planning at the time is kind of unknown, but you started to have a little bit of friction between the military leadership, the Smithsonian leadership, and the Taft administration, and ultimately the plan kind of fell apart. Now keep in mind at this point in time, the Smithsonian was being led by Mr. Langley, who we discussed earlier, who had a pretty big interest in aviation research. So that was one of the main other reasons that they wanted to put any kind of aerodynamic research under the Smithsonian. It just seemed like it would make sense. But the 1911 efforts to get a national aeronautical lab failed. Following year, there was a renewed effort to try to create some sort of national aerodynamic lab. Albert Jam was an aviation researcher from Catholic University in Washington, and he again proposed forming a national lab underneath the Smithsonian Institution. At the same time, though, there was a more concerted effort to try to get a national lab, and you had all sorts of different ideas being thrown around. Some wanted to see a national lab under the Smithsonian Institution. Others were saying, hey, look, we've got a couple colleges and universities around the United States here. Why not put a national aerodynamic lab with one of these universities, such as MIT, where you've got your aerodynamics department, your meteorology department, your engineering, your other sciences all together, and it could be better for coordinating things. The feeling was the university would just have more success than the Smithsonian in engaging multidisciplinary efforts to increase aviation research. Again, didn't go anywhere really quickly at the time, but one of the big supporters of Jam's proposal of putting it with the Smithsonian was Captain W. Irving Chambers, who served as a special advisor on aviation to the Secretary of the Navy at the time. And Chambers pointed out that, look, we're spending years here trying to figure out how to create a national laboratory to focus on aviation needs. Meanwhile, the Europeans over across this ocean are creating these national laboratories, and they're really moving, and we've got to get more aggressive on this whole thing. Chambers suggested that the Americans follow at the time what was a British committee model, where the lab was really more of a conceptual lab to coordinate between different departments, ultimately overseen by a committee with different government agencies. So here in the United States, every time we pitched an idea to create some sort of national aeronautical lab, you started to have infighting between different branches of the military, different federal agencies, and even private sectors on how to get this done. The idea that Chambers was proposing was to basically say, okay, we're going to have a committee oversee research and development for aviation in this country, and the committee can be made up of all these different governmental agencies and some of the private sector folks in order to try to eliminate a lot of the infighting. Ultimately, such a committee would be more of a coordinating body. So it would be less decision-making itself, more coordinating various research efforts of different agencies out there to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts. And what Chambers proposed was that this would ultimately be under the Smithsonian and initially funded by the federal government, but the goal of engaging private sector industry out there would mean that after a couple years, it would probably be a self-sufficient committee coordinating aviation research in the country that would not need federal funding. So that was debated for a little bit, but then on December 19th of 1912, President Taft appointed 19 people to a National Aerodynamic Laboratory Commission. Now at this point, President Taft had just was pretty much ending his term as president, so there was a lame duck session going on, and that's kind of what spurred part of this. But Basically, this group of 19 people was known as the Woodward Commission, as it was led by Robert Woodward, who at the time was the president of the Carnegie Institute in Washington, D.C. Other notable members of the commission did include both Jamin Chambers, who we've kind of mentioned earlier today. So during the first meeting of this commission, Congress began to draft legislation that would establish that we needed to have some sort of advisory committee based on the plan Chambers put forth. An advisory committee made up of different agencies out there. There was a debate as to whether or not to have this committee fall underneath the Smithsonian, and there was also a debate as to whether the research focus that the committee could mandate would be more theoretical or more practical research and development. Do we want to look at the theory of flight, or do we want to look into how we could actually do some practical research and development? And of course, there was no immediate consensus on what type of research to prioritize or whether to put it under the Smithsonian. But soon World War I did break out, and that caused things to move a little bit quicker in terms of actual decision making. So on March 3rd of 1915, the Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was formed. Again, this was in response to the outbreak of World War I. Congress decided to go ahead and just support the committee aspects of the National Aeronautics Laboratory concept. They allocated about $5,000 for the establishment and funding of this committee. And for the first, just to put that in perspective, that would be about $130,000 in today's money. So what ended up happening was, instead of having Congress actually pass a bill that established an advisory committee for aeronautics, they actually tabbed it in with the Naval Appropriations Bill in March of that year, and that way there didn't need to have to be significant public debate over what all this committee was going to be tasked with. Part of the reason, again, was to avoid, yeah, I already covered that. So the committee started, and one of the first things that they ended up doing was, well, first off, several advocates of the new organization still wanted to have a national laboratory, all right? So again, the whole early part of aviation in the United States was there wanted to be some sort of actual research and development laboratory that could start to actually focus on things. That ended up turning into more of an idea where we would just have a committee that would coordinate research and development being done by various agency laboratories. So it was a decentralized system. You still had advocates who wanted there to be an actual centralized laboratory, series of laboratories under this committee, but legislation behind the creation of the Advisory Committee on Aeronautics did not actually specify any specific funding for a laboratory or even give a mandate for a laboratory. There was nothing in the law that said that this committee could have a laboratory. And it turns out that there was really nothing in this law that really said the committee could do much of anything at all. Basically, the legislation said there will be this committee to oversee aeronautical development, but it didn't give them a whole lot of guidance. Part of the reason behind this was that Wilson was still trying to maintain some amount of neutrality with the war in Europe. Congress did create this committee in response to the war breaking out, but we didn't really want to get too involved at this point in time. So with that being said, about a month later in April, the Advisory Committee had their first meeting. And one of the first acts that they did was to change their name from the Advisory Committee on Aeronautics to the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, a decision that actually still has some relevance today, because if you're looking at this acronym NACA, that kind of sounds like a similar acronym that all of us are quite familiar with. More on that a little bit later today. So again, they're a committee, they don't really have much to do, so they say, you know what? We actually want to go out and survey what the current status is of aeronautical research and aeronautical research facilities across the country. All right, what research into flight are we currently doing or have we done, and what research labs exist across the country? Which honestly is a pretty smart move overall.
How much of that was driven by World War I starting in November of 1914?
Quite a bit. So again, I think I had the wrong date there on that previous slide. That said 1915. I believe that should have been 1913. Because the whole reason that Congress stopped bickering and really moved on establishing a committee was because they figured, okay, with the war breaking out in Europe, we're going to get drawn into this at some point. And there was an acceptance within the presidential administration at the time that aviation was going to be crucial for any kind of military operation, or that we needed to really get a little more comfortable with that. So again, that was part of the early spurring of this. Now, throughout World War I, NACA's role is going to remain a little bit murky, but they start to get themselves moving in a direction once the United States did enter the war. So ultimately, within NACA, there was kind of a couple different committees here, because basically for the first several years of existence, NACA really operated by committee. You had an executive committee which steered the policy and the overall direction of what types of research NACA was going to focus on, but ultimately, if they identified some sort of aviation problem they wanted to address or look into, they'd create a subcommittee to focus on it, which is all fine and good if you're dealing with something simple with only one or two problems, but when you're in your first decade or so of flight research, there's a lot of things you need to look into. And over time, more and more committees got formed. At the same time, the executive committee knew good leadership was going to be essential if you actually want to be able to get anything done. So what they did at the time was they hired an individual named George Lewis to be the executive director, kind of the administrator of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. Lewis's name is one that is still held by one of the labs across the country, I believe. Pay wasn't particularly good for employees at NACA, but what was interesting about it was that they really had a lot of free rein over what kind of research to pursue. So if you were a young up-and-coming engineer and you wanted to really look into some of the craziness of early flight research, if there were projects you wanted to pursue, if you partnered with the university or a private sector industry, oftentimes you're going to find yourself confined into specific topics that you could research. What NACA basically said is, look, we are not going to be able to pay you a huge salary compared to some of these other agencies out there, but if you come work for us, you're going to have a lot of free rein to choose what kind of research projects related to flight you wanted to pursue. And that was actually very effective into building an early cadre of scientists and engineers within NACA to focus on flight-related research. At the same time, Lewis also started to focus on trying to reorganize this whole committee conundrum. Because again, you can't just run an agency by forming a subcommittee to tackle each and every problem. That becomes very dissociated, very disorganized. So he began reorganizing the committee structure to improve efficiency and to turn it more into a formalized organization. So during World War I, NACA was getting involved in a lot of military-related research efforts. And during this time, they were trying to establish themselves in terms of what their actual goals were for accomplishment. At first, NACA didn't really have any real laboratories of their own, so they relied on contracts with educational institutions to undertake work. They couldn't do their own research, but if they realized that, hey, we're seeing all these problems with these airplanes, or this one particular problem with these different types of airplanes, let's contract with this university or this company to research and try to find a solution to that. So they were pretty much putting money towards solving a lot of these early problems. Early successes of NACA coordination with education and other industries include research on aircraft engines and propellers. One of the early successes, for instance, was something called the Liberty engine, which was pretty important in this period of time of early flight. Congress actually ended up approving some funding for a research and development laboratory, however, in 1917, which was going to start to change the picture. Instead of NACA being more of a coordinating and contracting entity, they were actually able to start trying to figure out how to do practical research of their own. However, it would be some time before that laboratory would actually come to fruition. So following World War I, NACA was still in the process of determining its identity. All right, We didn't have as many military needs for research in the years after World War I there at first, and basically what NACA had found is it had been effective in aiding in the war effort, but still lacked any research and development capabilities. Yeah, they're going to have a laboratory, but it's going to take 3 to 5 years to build, so they're still waiting on that. And to some outside of NACA, they still viewed it looked kind of disorganized, which Lewis was still working to try to fix that by reorganizing the committee structure, but it just kind of the outsiders looked like it had some growing to do. It did find that shortly after World War I, it did gain responsibility in undertaking more and more aerodynamic research as the labs began to come online, which was dramatic for expanding the role because, again, it made it easier to start bringing in some engineers. It made it easier for them to start working with different government agencies to kind of show where their value was going to be. And the next real big step here happened on June 11th, 1920, when Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory was able to open. Now, the charter for NACA, again, did not include any provision that said they could have a laboratory, but there was nothing in there that prohibited it, which was ultimately why Congress decided to allocate some funding for this. So it took a couple years for this to be built, but some of the initial facilities were completed in 1920, and the focus initially started on theoretical studies. They started to build some significant wind tunnels in Langley that could be used to start to really look at different aircraft designs and what that could lead to. One of these types of wind tunnels was called a variable density wind tunnel. It was one of the early instruments at Langley, and it was quite impressive. They really started to build their niche around these wind tunnels and the different types of research they could do with those. So Langley started initially with 43 staff members, but they had quite a lot of autonomy. As we said earlier, they generally had a lot of free rein to develop their own research projects based around their interests. Sometimes NACA would prioritize certain things, but there was a lot of freedom there, and that helped bring in a lot of great minds to NACA. It was a slow early start during World War I, but once Langley opened, they really were able to start to increase their staff. And it did not take long at all before some of the research output coming from Langley started to be widely heralded as top of the country and even world-renowned pretty soon. So I've said on multiple times here that NACA was a coordinating entity, all right? So how do you coordinate research prioritization? So in general, key breakthroughs in aeronautical research resulted from significant investments in the research, specifically financial as well as time investments into that research. So part of the challenge was that the payoff for a lot of these projects ultimately didn't come for several years. So early research undertaken by NACA ultimately focused on broad areas that would be applicable towards different types of aircraft out there. So they didn't want to focus on research that would benefit a specific type of airplane or research that would benefit a specific company, but they were trying to use their initial limited resources to spread the love a little bit and see how they could handle that. NACA did ultimately develop a vetting process for approving different types of research proposals that were brought before it. So when a request for research came into NACA by a government agency, the military, a private sector entity, the executive committee would approve, deny, or table them on the basis of whether or not these requests promised the ability to be kind of widespread in terms of their, let me put that a different way, based on how widely applicable the results of that research would be. Some projects could be of a long duration, but oftentimes they were meant to be more shorter duration, and any rules with prioritization were sometimes kind of overlooked when it came to some of the military needs during the 20s and early 30s. Once a project received approval, NACA's Director of Research, who is George Lewis at this time, would be responsible for putting together the kind of bureaucracy to back that up. Basically, how the payments are handled, what the budget would be, what the time frame, and all that could be amended based on any of the financial needs or research needs of NACA. So things during the 20s generally went really well from an expansionist, in the perspective of expanding NACA and what they were able to do for aviation research. But then we get to the mid-1930s and things start to become a little bit challenging. NACA did very little with aeronautical theory and instead focused more on empirical research, trying to give engineers the best tools they could use in order to develop their aircraft. And again, NACA had very strong wind tunnel systems that they could deal with. So I do apologize, I must have dropped a slide here, so that kind of explains. So basically, during the early to mid-30s, as Langley grew in terms of their operations, they really focused on a lot of wind tunnel technology. And because of that, as they created more wind tunnels, their research was a lot less theoretical and a lot more empirical of using wind tunnels to see how different aircraft designs would end up working under different considerations. NACA was able to perform great research into aircraft engine drag, for instance, increasing the efficiency of aircraft engines. With that being said, again, by the early 1930s, NACA was pretty world-renowned for their ability to lead aircraft research. So we had gone from the years of early flight there where the United States was really lagging behind to now the early to mid-30s where we're really catching up, if not ahead in many ways. They started to realize in the 1930s that there was a sudden uptick in research and development related to aircraft in Europe, mainly in Germany, where it really seemed like they were ramping up aircraft research and development quite a bit. Britain and France also were still showing that they were increasing their R&D capabilities related to aircraft a lot, but Germany was really diving into this. So late in 1936, Director Lewis led a delegation to tour some of the aeronautical facilities across Germany, and what they found was kind of alarming. They found that the R&D capabilities were actually moving a lot faster than they initially thought, and it was noted that these employees of these facilities were really working under high pressure, pretty much 24/7 aircraft development operations and aircraft production operations. Basically, it became really clear to the delegation from NACA in Germany that the United States needed to significantly expand our R&D capabilities as well because they were just not there. When they returned, NACA's leadership established a special committee on the relation of NACA to national defense, and basically what ended up happening was that NACA started to take more of a defense prioritization effort here, where a lot of their research and development started to focus more on military needs than it had in the decade leading up to this. Basically, all this was spurred by fears by those in NACA that America was losing its edge on aerospace technology. So, around the same time, you started to see a couple of new research facilities open across the United States under the guise of NACA. Ames Aeronautical Laboratory opened in California. The Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory opened near Cleveland, Ohio, Glenn Research Center today. You had Wallops Flight Center open in Virginia. The Muroc Flight Test Unit was also in California. Kind of the thought there was that you had a lot of aviation industry in California at the time, so they wanted to start building some West Coast facilities to better coordinate with those companies and private sector aviation contractors out that way. So in 1938, NACA began to consider where to open all these different facilities, and around the same time, Charles Lindbergh started to push with NACA leadership on the importance of starting to research with jet propulsion, which is ultimately why we got the research lab in Cleveland. We were really good at this time with a lot of different research aspects related to aviation, but jet propulsion was just not something that we were mastering yet, and that's going to kind of continue for a bit. But the United States, by the late 30s, was really adopting a wartime footing in how they were prioritizing aviation research. is the United States prepared for the possibility of entering another war? U.S. leaders recognized how unprepared they were to command the skies. So Roosevelt's aides recounted that Roosevelt was pretty confident that we were not going to be able to win a European war unless we were able to command the skies, and we just were not really there. So Roosevelt tried to push appropriations through Congress to build 30,000 modern aircraft. This was in 1938. Ultimately, he was provided with enough funding to procure maybe 6,000 new planes. So again, they were just really behind the 8 ball there in terms of how many aircraft they had at their dispense. In 1940, the National Defense Act was passed, and that did actually provide huge appropriations that would allow for the procurement of 6,000 new planes, but that was quickly followed by a massive expansion on aircraft production in the United States. So by 1940, NACA was really leading a lot of the R&D efforts with the military preparing for a potential European conflict, and Congress by then was starting to appropriate the funds to be able to expand on the amount of aircraft that were able to be produced. At the same time, the composition of NACA's main committee, the executive committee, changed to be more pro-military. So in the early 30s, before we started to try to ramp up our production, again, most of the research was trying to be prioritized in being able to be broadly applicable, both to military, other government agencies, and private sector. But by this point, you started to see most NACA-related projects being military in nature. At the same time, you also started to see a massive expansion in staff with NACA, where over the course of a couple of years, they went from 1,000 employees to over 5,000. Now, part of that, of course, was because of the wartime posture that NACA was looking at. Also, part of it, though, is that they had just opened a couple new labs. So, I mean, you need to make sure you've got appropriate and adequate staffing for those labs. But once we got into World War II, NACA's focus was really on a variety of projects that related to the efficiency of various aircraft, trying to make sure that they were effective in combat and things like that. These would include things like cleaning up drag on aircraft designs to improve efficiency, refining the shape of wings and bodies of aircraft, and even working on engine power and thrust. So all those were easy enough to fight, but it turned out that NASA had a little bit of a jet propulsion, NACA had a little bit of a jet propulsion problem. They just could never seem to master the ability to coordinate research related to jets. Propellers were economical for American manufacturers, and that's why historically there just had not been a lot of work done with jet propulsion in the United States. There wasn't really a huge need for it prior to the war. Engineers just in general failed to grasp the importance of jet engines moving forward. So with that being said, NACA was really keeping their focus more on wartime production and less on the theoretical potential use for jets. So while some like Charles Lindbergh were lobbying for more jet research, it just was not given the same focus and did not have some of the same successes that other aspects of aircraft design did. Now, as we got into the post-war period of time, both NACA and the federal government had changed overall. So leading up to World War II, NACA was that coordinating entity trying to help prioritize research among different agencies in the private sector and trying to make sure that there was a lack of duplication of effort and to just make sure everybody was on the same page. During World War II, though, you had a lot of government agencies, especially within the military departments, who were doing a lot of things on their own because they just had to. So as we got out of World War II, the need for NACA was rather different because it was no longer NACA coordinating national R&D efforts. You literally had different branches of the military with their own R&D capabilities that had massively expanded. You had private sector with their R&D capabilities that had massively expanded. And basically, the institution, during World War II, we really saw the institutionalization of science and technology into pretty much every aspect of government operations. This pretty much gave NACA a little bit of an identity crisis as we left the World War II period of time. Most of the government agencies that had previously relied on NACA now had enough of their own capabilities where there really was more of a lack of need for them. So these agencies out there, they still saw value in NACA, as did Congress, but it was just different. So what ended up happening was during the mid to late 1940s, NACA declined in significance, but we saw some greater partnerships going on with the branches of the military at the same time. So basically, it would focus a lot less on cooperative ventures and a lot more in support of developing military aircraft at the time. Now, as I've mentioned a few times, NACA had a great series of wind tunnels, especially over at Langley, and what they were able to do previously was a lot of practical aircraft testing. But at this point in time, the late 40s and early 50s, we saw let me get my thoughts straight here. In the late 40s, early 50s, you started to see a push to get aircraft that could go a lot faster. And the problem was that the wind tunnels that NACA operated in Langley could simulate up to a certain speed, but once you start using the word sound barrier, those wind tunnels became a little bit less effective in how they could actually model things. So what ended up happening was that they found that you really needed to actually use aircraft to investigate supersonic aviation, build faster and faster aircraft, and do practical testing with those aircraft. And someday we'll get better, someday they would get better wind tunnels where they could validate some of the results of these test flights. So one of the first types of aircraft that came about was one that was called the XS-1. So basically, one of the problems that they were trying to identify here, or work themselves through, was that in this region of speed called the transonic regime. So basically, between Mach 0.8 and Mach 1.2, they just could not simulate. So we needed to have aircraft that could go that fast, and then get results from those aircraft flights to review later. So NACA used what was called NACA basically relied on airplanes that were called the X-plane series. So the XS-1 started as a joint project between NACA and the Air Force with the ultimate goal of overcoming the sound barrier. And this was basically a 50 caliber bullet designed plane that was designed to fly at least 650 miles an hour at about 20,000 feet above the ground. Did not have a jet engine, but instead had a rocket engine that burned alcohol and distilled water, and basically had enough thrust there for 1,500 pounds of thrust for 2.5 minutes of flight. So that was able to get folks moving pretty fast. And the first person to break the sound barrier, of course, was Chuck Yeager on October 14th of 1947. He was able to achieve a speed of 700 miles an hour, or Mach 1.06, in the Bell X-1. So that's all fine and good. Following that support, NACA worked with the Air Force to develop even faster planes. So over the course of the next couple years, they developed the X-1A, the X-1B, the X-1E, and eventually all that led to the creation of the F-104 Starfighter. NACA also partnered with the Navy to develop jet-powered planes, which were able to take pilot Scott Crossfield to excessive Mach 2 in 1953. The Air Force in 1957 was able to get an X-2 plane to Mach 3, though Captain Milburn Apt did perish during that flight. So by the mid-1950s, we were going a lot faster than we were during the World War II period of time, hitting Mach 3. And NACA was able to build wind tunnels that could start to now test this supersonic speed regime here. So we were able to get into a point where we could start to validate our data from these various tests. Now, with this being said, it was time to look to the next possible type of air flight to study, and that was going to become hypersonic flight. So NACA started getting more involved with research that involved hypersonic flight, and basically what the plan was to create what they called the X-15 plane. This was more of a slender design aircraft compared to the previously shown X-1 that looked more like a bullet pretty much, but it allowed for supersonic flight that was it just allowed for faster and faster flight. The Air Force awarded the contract to North American Aviation, but ultimately, by the time the X-15 was developed, NACA would have no longer existed by that time, because it was going to take nearly a decade, I believe, for that to actually get created. So a lot of those were rocket-powered planes, but it turns out that NACA was also having some successes by this point in jet propulsion. There were very few early successes in jet propulsion, but by the late 40s and early 50s, they did manage to improve the efficiency and safety of jet engines. NACA also started to focus a lot on rocket technology. They first started to think about rocket technology as being pretty important during World War II, but during World War II, they created what they called the Pilotless Aircraft Research Division over at Langley, Virginia again, and that was headed by a man named Robert Gilruth, who was one of the most important figures in United States human spaceflight in those early years. So Gilruth established Wallops Island along the eastern shore there of Virginia in 1945, and they tested hundreds of different rockets during the late 1940s. In the 1950s, they started to focus on the development of multi-stage rockets to get them higher into the atmosphere. And these studies actually helped to position his group to start to become a lead force or a lead entity in the United States as we transition more to a focus on space flight. Basically, as we entered the late 1950s here, NACA would be world-renowned for its research and development capabilities, especially as it pertained to some of that rocketry. Well, in the mid to late 50s, the International Council of Scientific Unions decided to plan an international geophysical year, and it would run from July 1st, 1957 to December 31st, 1958. That was a pretty long year, I guess, but that would all work. And their coordinated goal was to get a satellite into Earth orbit. So, of course, we're going to play around with that. Part of this effort that the United States would pursue would be let's go at this a different way. So the United States put out a mission here to try to get some actual effort that was going to get us to put a satellite into space. And various entities out there put out different ideas for how to get a satellite into space. Ultimately, the Naval Research Laboratory proposed Project Vanguard, and this was selected to be the United States' effort to get a satellite into the air, into orbit. Project Vanguard would use a non-ballistic Viking rocket. It would not interfere with the high-priority ballistic development programs that were ongoing at the same time. Now, while we amateur astronomers are very interested in rocketry for getting things into space, the Eisenhower administration at this time was in a little bit of an arms race with the Soviets, and we were trying to figure out how to be able to use ballistic missiles to basically get weapons from here into Soviet Russia at the time. So while the Eisenhower administration was interested in getting a satellite into space to support the geophysical year, they just did not want it to interfere with any efforts to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles at the time. Now, the Eisenhower administration was not the only administration that was taking that view. Khrushchev in Russia at the same time was fine with Korolev pursuing his own rocket to get Sputnik into space, just so long as it would not slow down Russian ballistic missile development. But hey, we had Project Vanguard, and that's what we were sticking to. Now, there was a lot of publicity towards Project Vanguard at the time, but it never really had the funding necessary to actually get the satellite into space in a timely manner. So, with that being said, the Russians ended up getting Sputnik into space and beat us to it. So, basically, this is a polished metal sphere that was 23 inches in diameter with 4 external radio antennas. Amateur radio operators were able to kind of hear this thing beep as it went across the sky, and a lot of people reported being able to go out at night and see Sputnik in the night sky. More than likely, that was probably the booster rocket that was traveling behind Sputnik, but either way, they had something in orbit that Americans could look up and see a couple times a night. So with that being said, obviously there was going to be an American reaction to Russia putting Sputnik into space. But despite some references out there to mass panic and hysteria, there was just not initially a huge shock by the American public. Really what the comment a lot of people were saying at the time, based on what I've read, was that, the Russians were talking about how they were going to get this satellite into space, and it's no surprise they finally got it up there. But the speed at which they got that up there did kind of shock a few folks in the Eisenhower administration. There were a couple of polls put out in the weeks after Sputnik just to gauge people's temperature on this. And what the evidence from those polls shows is that there was a lot of excitement about the future prospects of space, but there was not a whole lot of panic yet about the fact that the Russians had gotten a satellite into space. A couple other things that were interesting about early surveys of the American public after Sputnik in those initial weeks. Few Americans were surprised about the launch, but very few Americans knew anything about the progress that the United States had made with rocketry or space flight at this time. Additional surveys generally found that America reacted to the launch of Sputnik more with logic than emotion. But never let a good event go without a little bit of political stuff, right? So President Eisenhower decided from his administration to choose a strategy of nonchalance following Sputnik. It was kind of congratulatory for the Russians for getting into space, but it was also, he was trying to focus on the fact that there had been a race to develop ballistic missiles, but not really a race to get a satellite into space. And if anybody in here really likes reading, there's a book out there called Mercury Rising that has a chapter pretty much that covers the initial Eisenhower administration's reaction to this, and it's pretty good. But what he was trying to do was point out that, this was sure shocking that they got that up there that quickly, because a lot of folks didn't expect the speed, but the focus needed to be on ballistic missile development. It wasn't meant to revolve around getting a satellite into space. Another thing that the administration pointed out at the time was that Sputnik didn't really add anything to science. The mere fact that they got something into orbit just did not really involve any new scientific discovery. It's not entirely true. From what I've read, the Americans actually did get quite a bit of data from monitoring Sputnik, so thanks. But their main strategy from the administration was to downplay the Soviet achievement and just try to figure out why a lot of the attention was going towards the launch of Sputnik here. Because of the nonchalant response, so that did cause some folks to have a little bit of doubts about his leadership. More on that here in a little bit. Probably the person most surprised so with those doubts of leadership, there was a lot of publicity around that. And you started to see folks like Lyndon Johnson take a bit of a larger role in terms of focusing in on kind of not only the missile gap, but now the satellite gap that the United States had around Russia. That surprised the administration, but it really surprised Khrushchev, who he was obviously thrilled that they had beat us into space or Sputnik, but he did not expect some of the political outcry. So not too long after that, they decided to launch Sputnik 2 into space. In order to up the ante a little bit, they included on this a dog named Laika. And basically, they were able to get the first living creature into space. Great for them, bad for Laika. But the media referred to this as Mutnik or Puchnik. I always thought the naming conventions of all this were pretty funny. But this is a 4-meter high cone-shaped capsule that weighed around 1,100 pounds. And we'll go off the slides here just to talk about a little bit of fun facts, I guess, here. But again, the race up to this point had been more ballistic missile development than actual satellite development, all right? So at this point in time, there was a little bit of a difference between capabilities of American nuclear weapons and Soviet nuclear weapons. Ours were generally seen as a little bit more accurate versus the Russians. So ours tended to be smaller, lighter weight. We did not need to have ballistic missiles that were as big as what the Soviets needed to carry theirs. Theirs were a lot larger, a lot heavier, and therefore in order to get their missiles up, they needed to be a lot more powerful. So it should come as no surprise that a meter and a half sphere, Sputnik 1, or a slightly larger sphere of a dog, weighs a lot less than a nuclear weapon. Hopefully that's not a surprise to anybody. So once you have a ballistic missile that can get a payload into space, get a nuclear weapon into space, well, it's really easy to just put a dog on top of that missile or put something else on top of that missile. And that's ultimately what the Russians were starting to do at this point. Same missile, but just different payloads. So anyway, with that, they quickly got two things into space. Our missiles at this point were just not powerful enough to get something something to carry a human into space, because again, we had different ways of getting our nuclear payloads over there at the time. All right, so after Sputnik 2, you started to see quite a lot of political turmoil in the country related to this. Using his Senate committee to really focus in on the gap between our space technology versus the Soviets, you started to see a lot of media attention to this, and you started to see a lot of public concern, because the narrative was no longer, hey look, we've got a future space flight, now we have things orbiting in air. The concern was, oh no, they can get a nuclear weapon into air and drop it on our heads. So at this point, you had a lot of panic among the American public. So Eisenhower decided to address the nation to candidly discuss what our current capabilities actually were. He used his speech to discuss the American capabilities, how they related to space, and how they were strong in some ways and weak in other ways. During this speech, you can see it that the launch of the Sputnik rockets were major achievements, but they weren't a threat at this point. They showed that there was technological competence that the U.S. could not ignore. I am probably going to butcher this, but the joke that was used, I think, contemporarily at the time was that we didn't need to worry about the Russians carrying a nuke in a suitcase into an American city because they don't have a good suitcase for the nuke. And that was kind of the philosophy. We knew they had nuclear weapons, but we vastly underestimated some of their other technological capabilities at the time. And that was what the administration was trying to dispel, that yeah, they're more technologically ahead than we thought. We need to be aware of that, but we're still not in imminent danger. At the same time, Eisenhower announced the creation of a White House office to advise him on science and technology. And this was going to start to play a bigger role as we move forward. And at the same time, Eisenhower and his administration were looking forward to the United States' response to the launch of the first two Sputnik rockets, which is going to be our Vanguard rocket launch to get our first satellite into space. It went not quite as well as they had hoped, but our first rocket launch that was generally called Stay Putnik got about 4 feet in the air before exploding. The good news is that Vanguard's 1A satellite did actually survive the explosion. It was thrown a short distance, and you can now see that at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. It was not going to work after the explosion, but it did actually survive. But needless to say, this was not the reaction the United States was hoping to have. So with that, Lyndon Johnson, senator at the time, was in charge of the Senate Preparedness Subcommittee, and they really started to bring a lot more attention to the American space program, America's lack of space capabilities at the time. So he began to strategize a response to the Soviets in order to beat the United States into space. Sorry. At this time, Johnson and some of his political strategists were looking at how they could kind of use this opportunity to focus more on politically building space capabilities here. So what they did was that they wanted to start by bringing attention to the space race gap. And he was going around Texas making speeches after the Sputniks, after the Vanguard launches, proposing that the United States needs to take a long, careful look at how our space capabilities compare to those of the Soviets. In Congress, the Senate technically, Johnson led a broad review of America's defense and space programs. And what happened was that basically there's a lot of publicity now, a lot more publicity to our space programs, even our defense programs, than Americans had really been accustomed to in the previous several years. And that led to a lot of panic as people started to think that, we're really running behind on all this. So Johnson, who was chair of the Senate Preparedness Subcommittee, he decided to open an official investigation to assess why the U.S. satellite program was apparently lagging behind the Soviets. And in 1958, the subcommittee issued a set of recommendations. Most of these pertained to missile development, but one key recommendation that was made was that the U.S. have a space program that's run by a new and independent agency. Now, what was really interesting was that that was just not a recommendation a lot of people put much attention to. A lot of people, aside from President Eisenhower. And I've read that actually caught Johnson off guard, that was like one of the first points from that report that the Eisenhower administration really started to look at, was to see about creating an independent space agency. Now, the Eisenhower Science Advisory Committee that he had formed after his Oval Office address, they were in favor of shifting non-defense space projects out of the Pentagon, but ultimately there was still a lot of discussion going on in terms of should a space program be military, should it be civilian, should it be an independent agency, or how should it handle? So Eisenhower's folks were initially in favor of moving non-defense projects out of the Pentagon. Eisenhower was kind of on the fence about it. He knew that ultimately, if it was left in the Pentagon, there could be some potential issues. So he decided that first off, he didn't necessarily feel that the Department of Defense would be able to be the most cost-effective way to handle a space program. He had been in plenty of positions within the military that he was worried just about how contracting might work and just how expensive that could get. He had actually played a role in his administration to try to curb the Department of Defense's tendency to justify higher costs in the name of national security. That was one of the things that he had been trying on multiple different fronts during his administration. He was worried that if NASA went under the military, they would justify higher and higher costs for things just under the guise of national security. And he felt that if you put a space agency as an independent agency, there'd be a lot more oversight into how their costs were managed. Eisenhower was also not very keen on militarizing space, and he knew that if it was a military space program, that you'd never really have a significant civilian component. So in 1958, Eisenhower ultimately approved the approach of a civilian space agency. And in April, just a couple months after Johnson's committee released their report, in April, Eisenhower sent a letter to Congress calling for the formation of a National Air and Space Agency. Ultimately, his thought was that the DoD, Department of Defense, would maintain or retain control of any defense-related space efforts, but the new agency would gain all the rest. And one of the other things he said was that this agency would absorb the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA. So that's kind of where all this came together. Congress received the draft bill in April and updated this agency to administration. That was their big change. So instead of it being the National Air and Space Agency, Congress said, no, let's call it the National Air and Space Administration. A little bureaucratic thing, but it just changes a little bit about how funding and leadership works. The Space Act was ultimately signed into law on July 29th of 1958. Now, around this time, you had a lot of military plans for manned spaceflight. There's kind of a little bit of a competition going. The Air Force had what they called the Man in Space Soonest program. It was a 4-part plan to land a human on the moon by 1965 using existing military boosters at an estimated cost of $1.5 billion. The U.S. Navy had something called the Manned Earth Reconnaissance Program. This would develop and launch a spacecraft that was a cylinder with spherical ends into space. It would inflate into a delta wing craft, but it would require a lot of research and, even more importantly, a lot of money, which is why that was not ultimately approved. And the United States Army had something called Project Adam. This would require the use of a modified Redstone booster to launch a pilot in a capsule along a steep ballistic curve. Ironically, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, when they were reviewing some of these proposals, did not see a lot of value in Project Adam, even though, in my opinion, it's kind of similar to the Mercury program itself. So in early 1958, the Air Force started to really get the fact that, you know, we're going to have a civilian space program here. But the Air Force still wanted to somehow be able to maintain their plans for being first in manned space flight. So they approached the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA, and said, hey, why not partner with us on some of these endeavors here? We can get this project up and running and moving pretty quickly. NACA kind of saw the writing on the wall as well, that they were going to get absorbed into NASA, civilian space program. They kind of hemmed and hawed a little bit, and ultimately they became NASA, and you still had a little bit of confusion over how this manned space flight was going to work. Because even with NASA, the Space Act, and neither the Space Act nor anything the Eisenhower administration had put out established who would be responsible for the space flight program. Would it be the civilian agency, or would it be one of these military programs? And you started to see a little bit more and more infighting between the military programs and NASA on this. And ultimately, President Eisenhower had to step in and say, you know what? We're going to focus on the manned in space soonest program here. We're going to put that under the jurisdiction of NASA. And before too long, that became Project Mercury. So Project Mercury, as we end this presentation tonight, would essentially load a human into a bell-shaped capsule on top of a ballistic missile. And the goal would be to, number one, get a human being above the atmosphere. And also, just as importantly, get him back down safely into the atmosphere and onto the ground. Over the next few years, there'd be a lot of publicity into Project Mercury and how all this would come together. And it would result in 6 successful flights and eventually the research and technology to get Neil Armstrong to land on the moon just around a decade or decade and a half later. So with that pretty much wraps up this part of the presentation. Down the road, I hope to be able to come back and talk a little bit about how the Mercury program really evolved, because it's super interesting, especially when you start to talk about the 3 programs I mentioned earlier in the earlier slide, and just how piloting a spacecraft is going to work. So with that, if anybody has any questions, I can go ahead and try to take those. I'm also going to turn the lights on just to blind folks.
So the Project Adam from the Army, did they actually, did they get any kind of love at all? I mean, that's what they wanted to do.
Yeah, because ultimately, the idea of using the bell-shaped capsule was not terribly different from what Project Adam had proposed, and ultimately they ended up using the Redstone rocket for the first 2 launches with the Project Mercury. The problem with the Redstone rockets was that they were good rockets, don't get me wrong, but they couldn't get a person super high into space. They could get Alan Shepard above the line, so we could get him into space, but we couldn't get him high enough to orbit. Same with Gus Grissom. So von Braun's team kind of was shifting from researching and developing the Redstone rocket to researching and developing the Atlas rocket, which so this is actually the Atlas rocket for John Glenn's launch. This had a lot more oomph, a lot more power, and could get a man higher enough to actually orbit the Earth. The problem was it was a really clunky process to finish up research and development on that. It's kind of funny. So they choose who the 7 Mercury astronauts are going to be. They have their little press conference, and just a short time later, they flew these guys out to Florida to watch the first actual test of the Atlas rocket. Goes up a few thousand feet and explodes right over their heads, pretty much, which was a really interesting thing. I think Al Shepard had a remark where I think he told the others, well, at least they got that one out of the way. So, I mean, they had a sense of humor, but when they're strapping you pretty much to a missile, you have to have a sense of humor. That's a long-winded way of saying that ultimately Project Mercury kind of had some aspects of Project Adam, but I think that was more out of convenience. Yeah, I don't know how to embed videos into PowerPoint, but there are some great videos of the Vanguard rocket exploding, so just something to keep in mind.
That was a regular disappointment.
Yeah, I think that the regular disappointment could be kind of a motto of the rocket teams there in the first years of the space program, but the United States, keep in mind, we did a really good job of publicizing all aspects of our space program. So when Project Vanguard failed, or when some of the Atlas missions failed in their tests, that was widely broadcasted for the American public. and then we look at what was going on in the Soviets, and it looks like out of nowhere, oh, a successful flight to get a man into space, and another successful flight to get a person into space. They were obviously a lot more secretive. And when you really look into it, the Soviet space program had its own challenges as it did its successes. And again, it just took decades before we started to see those. For those who really enjoy reading, there are two really good books on the Soviet space program I've read or listened to audiobooks over the last year. One is a book called Beyond, which goes into a lot of detail over some of the early astronauts of the Soviet program, and the other is called The Wrong Stuff. Not only because I love its name compared to the book The Right Stuff, but it does a really good job of kind of assessing what some of the problems were with the Soviet space program, that while they had some early successes, we did get Neil Armstrong on the moon first. Yes?
Well, I've read that Laker didn't make it back alive because of radiation that nobody knew of. But then NASA, or NACA, sent Ham the chimp in a shielded capsule, and he came back alive.
So, all right, question here. We've talked about Laika earlier. So, the question back there was along the lines of, where do we throw a dog into space there? All right, so Laika goes into space, does not make it. A couple years later, we send Ham, a chimpanzee, into space, comes back alive. Now, a couple differences in these two programs. Number one, there were a lot of issues with this flight. Oxygen issues, electrical issues, even heat and temperature issues. I don't know if it was radiation from the Van Allen belts that killed Laika.
Van Allen.
They didn't get into the Van Allen.
No, it was it burned out, but
Re-entry.
Okay.
I thought it was a
Well,
re-entry, but basically,
with Laika, I know she was high enough to get in orbit. I don't know whether she's in the radiation belts or not, but it took months before the capsule actually got back down. I think she was up in, did I put a date on there? I thought Sputnik 2 was also in the fall, maybe November, and it was April before her capsule came back down to Earth. They think she may have lived about 8 hours when she was in space.
She lived 4 orbits.
Sorry?
4 orbits, from what I read. 4 orbits, and there was a malfunction in the cooling system. She died.
yeah, died of
Yeah.
hypothermia, it says.
so, yeah.
Hypo or hyper?
Hyper.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Hyper.
Because and also keep in mind, when they sent Laika into space, they had the technology to get a capsule into space, just not the technology to get it out of space. So whether the dog knew it or not, probably not, she had a one-way ticket. Whereas with Ham the chimp, what they were trying to do was one last test flight before throwing Shepard up there. Ham's flight was a lot lower, so Ham was in space probably 7 to 12 minutes, give or take, before coming back down. And again, our goal was to actually do research on Ham. Their goal was to be able to say, hey, look what we did now while you guys are still down there bickering. So that was different. Now, what's funny is Ham's flight was not all roses itself, because they had miscalculated something, so there's a lot more propulsion in Ham's flight, and he actually got a lot higher than they thought, which was kind of great. Yeah, no, it's there's a lot of great jobs in the federal government. Being a test chimp is not one of them. Yeah, but no, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that happened with animals, but a lot of it's really depressing when you start getting into it.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up, though. Yes?
Something that the people ought to know about early flight was a man named Charlie Taylor. Now, he was their mechanic in their Wright Brothers bicycle shop. And they were trying to get a suitable engine for their aircraft. They wrote to the several engine manufacturers, and their all replies came back negatively. The Wright Brothers, they wanted to have an engine that would weigh about 180 pounds and produce about 12 horsepower. And all the engine manufacturers said that it's impossible to make an engine like that. But it was their mechanic in their bicycle shop, Charlie Taylor. All he had to work with was a drill press and a lathe, and he made that engine to power their airplane. And if it hadn't been for Charlie Taylor, the Wright brothers would have never been anything more than glider pilots. And to this day, all the aviation mechanics, every year they have their big get-together, and they have their Charlie Taylor Award, and the recipient gets a golden wrench.
That's pretty cool. If you're really into Wright Brothers stuff, folks, obviously Kitty Hawk, their first aerial flight, they've got a really nice memorial museum there, but you don't have to go that far to be able to see some cool Wright Brother related stuff, because about an hour and a half away from here in Dayton, you actually have a national park site, I forget what they actually call it, but it's where the Wright Brothers have their bike shop, and they do a wonderful job of just kind of honoring the Wright Brothers there. I don't know really anything about Taylor. I have to look into that, but thank you for that. And the other thing, of course, is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, of course, is located right next to, and I'm going to butcher this, I'm sorry, but it's like Carillon Park or Carolyn Park or something like that. And that's where the Wright brothers were really able to test their aircraft. I mean, we're talking a couple seconds in the air there, but after a year or two of their research and development in Dayton, they had really created a wonderful thing. Yes?
Well, what he's kind of implying is airplanes, just like cars, it's really a combination of several devices, inventions people did before. And well, just inside Indiana, there's there's an exit to one of the Wright brothers where they grew up. I can't remember which one it is. You gotta take a many exits out there in the midst of nothing. It's a dog. It's worth checking out though. But it's a dog to find that place. But
Yeah.
just inside of Indiana. I can't remember which one of the two though. Whoever was born in Indiana.
All right. Well, with that, I guess that concludes the presentation. In a little bit, I can go show the sea stars for anybody who's interested, and we'll go from there.
Okay.